The night in Carmel by the Sea felt ordinary, too ordinary. The streets were calm, the air crisp, and the dim glow of streetlights flickered against the sidewalk. A gentle breeze carried the scent of the ocean, mixing with the distant murmur of laughter from nearby cafes. It was the kind of evening where nothing unusual should happen. But then, Clint Eastwood stepped into Mission Ranch, and within seconds he knew something wasn't right. The restaurant buzzed with its usual warmth. Soft music played, conversations flowed, and the rich aroma of grilled steak filled the air. Everything seemed normal, almost. Then, a sound cut through the room. Faint, unsteady, wrong. A muffled sob. Clint stopped. His sharp instincts kicked in, scanning the space. It wasn't a loud cry, not something meant to be heard, but it had been. Someone in here was hurting, and Clint Eastwood never ignored something like that. Clint Eastwood didn't move right away. He stood just inside the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light of the restaurant. The familiar hum of conversation continued. Nothing seemed out of place, but he knew better. His gaze swept the room, trained to pick up the smallest details. Couples talked over candlelit tables. An older gentleman stirred his coffee. A bartender wiped down glasses. Everything looked normal, except it wasn't. The sound he had heard wasn't part of the usual rhythm. It didn't belong. Then he saw her. Near the service station, half hidden behind a partition, a young waitress stood with her back to the room. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her shoulders trembled as she took slow, uneven breaths, trying to steady herself. She wasn't making a scene. She wasn't seeking attention. She was doing everything she could to disappear. Clint narrowed his eyes. He had seen that look before, the kind that comes from holding in too much for too long. She wiped her face quickly, inhaled sharply, and straightened up. The moment she turned around, her expression was set, practiced, a mask. But Clint had already seen the cracks. He stayed where he was, unnoticed, watching as she exhaled and forced herself to walk back toward the dining area. Too controlled, too careful. Then, just as she passed by, a hushed conversation caught Clint's attention. A young busboy and another waitress stood near the bar, speaking in low voices. They weren't gossiping. They were worried. "He's been on her case all night," the busboy muttered, shaking his head. "She's new, too," the waitress replied, glancing toward the kitchen doors. "Just started last month." Clint listened, silent and still. "It's disgusting," the busboy added, his voice tense. "And nobody's saying a damn thing." That was all Clint needed to hear. His jaw tightened slightly, his hands slipping into his pockets. Now he knew. Someone in this restaurant had decided to make that girl's night hell. And everyone else? They were looking the other way. Clint shifted his focus back to the dining room. Time to find the man responsible. Clint's eyes moved slowly across the dining room, scanning each table, reading body language the way a hunter reads tracks. It didn't take long to find him. In the far corner, a middle-aged man sat comfortably, too comfortably, like he owned the place. He looked to be in his late 50s, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his tie loosened just enough to show he'd had more than one drink. His laughter cut through the air, loud and forced, the kind that demanded attention. The people around him didn't seem as entertained as he was. Two men sat with him, nodding absently, pretending to listen. A woman, seated just beside him, kept her eyes down, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. She wasn't smiling. Clint had been around long enough to know what he was looking at. A man who enjoyed being in control. And then he saw the waitress. She moved carefully through the room, tray balanced on one arm, stepping toward the table like someone walking through a minefield. Her posture stiffened, her breath slowed, but she didn't turn back. She had no choice but to face him. The man didn't look at her right away. He was in the middle of a story, hands moving wildly as he exaggerated some joke that only he seemed to find funny. His voice filled the space around him, drowning out the softer conversations. Then he turned his head. A slow smirk tugged at his lips as he saw her standing there. "Ah, look who's back," he drawled, leaning back in his chair like he was settling in for a show. The woman at the table looked away. One of the men checked his watch, suddenly interested in the time. The waitress set a fresh glass of water in front of him, careful, measured. "There you go, sir," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Oh, so now you're polite?" He laughed, shaking his head before turning to his friends. "See, all it takes is a little coaching. Push them enough, and they figure it out." Clint's jaw tightened. He had seen plenty of men like this. They weren't tough. They weren't powerful. They were just loud enough, just cruel enough to make people afraid to push back. The waitress didn't react. She gripped her tray a little tighter, her fingers pressing into the wood. But she didn't speak. That wasn't enough for him. The man picked up his fork, inspecting his plate like he was judging something far beneath him. He clicked his tongue. "You know what? I think you got my order wrong," he said lazily. The waitress blinked, her lips parting slightly. She knew what was happening. "I'm sorry, sir. You asked for the rib-eye medium." "No, no, no." He waved a hand. "I said medium rare. See, this is what I mean. You just don't listen." Clint saw it, the barely there hesitation in the girl's face. She wasn't confused. She was cornered. "Would you like me to have the kitchen fix it?" she asked, keeping her tone level. "Oh, what? Now I gotta wait another half hour." The man scoffed, leaning forward slightly. His voice dropped just enough to make it personal. "Maybe if you weren't so busy running your mouth, you'd be better at your job." That was the moment she cracked. Not in a way anyone else might notice, but Clint did. The smallest shift in her jaw. A quiet inhale. A flicker of something in her eyes before she turned away and disappeared through the kitchen doors. That was where Clint had seen her before, crying, trying to pull herself together. He had heard enough. But before he could move, the waitress reappeared, walking straight toward that table. No tears, no hesitation, just a quiet kind of determination that told Clint she was ready for round two. And that didn't sit right with him. Clint shifted his weight slightly, hands still in his pockets. Now it was his turn to step in. The waitress stepped back onto the floor, shoulders squared, face unreadable. She moved with quiet purpose, tray balanced effortlessly, as if nothing had happened. But Clint saw the truth. She was bracing herself. She weaved through the tables, eyes fixed ahead, stopping just short of the corner booth. Her breath was steady, her grip firm, but there was something in the way she held herself, a careful stillness, like someone walking a tightrope. The man didn't acknowledge her at first. He was still talking, still playing the entertainer, dragging out another exaggerated story for his unimpressed audience. His hand moved as he spoke, gesturing lazily, his laughter rising above the low murmur of the room. Then he saw her. His smirk returned, slow and deliberate. "Took you long enough," he muttered, swirling the ice in his glass. The waitress set the replacement plate down in front of him. No reaction, no hesitation. She had learned long ago that some things weren't worth a response. But the man wasn't done. "What's wrong? You go cry in the back before coming out here." His voice was light, teasing, but the edge beneath it was sharp. She didn't flinch, didn't move, just nodded slightly and took a step back. Clint saw the shift, the barely there tremor in her fingers as she adjusted the tray against her hip. Then the man reached, not aggressively, not forcefully, but just enough. A hand hovering near her wrist, just close enough to make her tense. And that was it. A quiet line had been crossed. Clint's voice cut through the air, steady and firm. "That's enough." The room went still. The man froze mid-smirk, his drink halfway to his lips. Slowly, he turned his head, eyebrows raised. "Who the hell are you?" Clint didn't move. He didn't have to. Just a man who doesn't like bullies. The table fell silent. The waitress exhaled softly, stepping back. Not out of fear, but relief. The man chuckled, shaking his head, leaning back in his chair. "Got yourself a little hero complex, old man?" Clint didn't blink, didn't break eye contact. "No," he said, voice quiet but certain. Just a problem with men like you. The shift was immediate. The balance of power had changed. For the first time that night, the man wasn't in control anymore. And he knew it. A thick silence settled over the restaurant. The air, once filled with light chatter and the clinking of silverware, now hung heavy. The man at the table slowly turned his head toward Clint, brows furrowed, eyes narrowing as if trying to decide whether this was a joke. "Who the hell are you?" he scoffed, the smirk returning, but weaker this time. Clint didn't answer right away. He simply held the man's gaze, unshaken, unreadable. "Just a man who doesn't like bullies," he finally said, voice even, calm, but carrying more weight than any threat ever could. The smirk faltered for just a second. The man let out a forced chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "Bullies? Over a damn waitress?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "You got no idea what you're talking about, old man." Clint took a step forward. Not rushed, not aggressive, just deliberate. The wooden floor creaked slightly beneath his boot. "No," Clint said, tilting his head slightly. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I watched you humiliate someone who was just doing her job. And now you're sitting here thinking that makes you powerful." The restaurant remained eerily still. Forks hovered midair, glasses paused at lips. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked onto the scene unfolding before them. The man forced another chuckle, but it was different this time, nervous, unsure. He glanced at his friends for backup, but none of them met his eyes. The woman at the table shifted uncomfortably. One of the men cleared his throat and reached for his drink, suddenly more interested in the melting ice in his glass than the situation at hand. He was alone. The smirk returned, but this time, it didn't reach his eyes. "You got a problem, old man?" His voice was lower now, as if testing how far Clint would take this. Clint didn't blink, didn't move, didn't need to. Then he took another step forward. "Careful," he said, the single word landing like a hammer. The man stiffened. His fingers twitched slightly against the table before he forced them still. He was realizing, too late, that this wasn't a conversation he controlled anymore. The weight of silence pressed against him. He let out a sharp breath, trying to shake the unease creeping up his spine. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "All this over some..." Clint cut him off before he could finish. "Say it." The man's mouth snapped shut. The tension in the air was suffocating now. It was no longer just about the waitress, no longer about a wrong order or a misplaced insult. This was about power. About a man who had spent his whole life talking down to others, and was now face to face with someone he couldn't intimidate. His hands curled into fists on the table before he forced himself to relax them. He exhaled sharply, jaw tight, eyes darting around the room again. But there was no way out. Not this time. The restaurant remained silent. No forks clinked against plates. No murmured conversations filled the air. Every eye was fixed on the scene unfolding at the corner table. The man, once so sure of himself, sat frozen. His smirk had disappeared. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He glanced at his friends, looking for support, but none of them met his gaze. The woman beside him stared at her drink, her fingers tracing the rim of the glass. The other man cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, suddenly uninterested in the confrontation. The power he had wielded so easily all night gone. Still, he tried to fight back. "You got a real problem, old man," he muttered, his voice low. Clint didn't respond. He just watched. No anger, no raised voice, just that steady, unshakable presence. The man shifted uncomfortably, rolling his shoulders as if trying to shake off the discomfort crawling up his spine. He forced out a chuckle, but no one joined him. The room wasn't on his side anymore. Clint took a single step closer. "Apologize." The man let out a breath through his nose, shaking his head. "Fine. Sorry." Clint didn't move, didn't blink. "That's not an apology." The man's jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists on the table. His pride fought against the inevitable, but he could feel it, the walls closing in. Slowly, he lifted his eyes to the waitress. "I'm sorry," he said, quieter this time. For the first time that night, he meant it. A breath of relief rippled through the room. Conversations resumed, though softer now, and the restaurant felt lighter, as if something heavy had just been lifted. Clint took a step back. The job was done. A quiet tension still hung in the air, though the weight of the moment had shifted. The bully sat stiffly, his face tight with forced composure, but there was no fight left in him. His appetite was gone, his drink untouched. The people around him weren't laughing anymore. The restaurant manager finally stepped forward. A wiry man in his 50s, he had been watching from a distance, uncertain whether to step in. Now he cleared his throat, glancing between Clint and the table. "We don't tolerate behavior like that here," he said firmly, shifting his stance. "That man should leave." The waitress, who had remained silent through it all, suddenly spoke up. "No." The manager turned, surprised. Even Clint raised an eyebrow slightly. She stood tall now, her shoulders squared, no longer shrinking under the weight of humiliation. "He can stay," she said, voice steady. "But I won't serve him." For the first time that night, she had taken control on her terms. The manager hesitated, then nodded. Clint didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and set a crisp $100 bill on the counter. "Not charity," he said simply, his voice low. "Recognition for good service." The waitress swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her tray, but she nodded. Without another word, Clint turned and made his way toward the door. The night air was cool against his skin as he stepped outside, the distant crash of waves filling the silence. He hadn't come looking for trouble. He never did. But sometimes trouble found the wrong person. And when that happened, Clint Eastwood made sure it didn't go unanswered. Life is full of people who think power comes from putting others down. But real strength? The standing up even when no one else does. Kindness isn't weakness, and respect isn't optional.